The manor stood at the edge of a long road, dark against a sky the color of old iron. Rain had fallen for 2 days without stopping, and now the wind pushed the last of it against the tall windows in soft grey sheets. Inside the great house, most of the candles had been put out. The fires had burned low. The servants had gone to their beds hours ago, and the halls were quiet in the way old houses become quiet when they have been quiet for a long time. In a small room at the top of the east wing, a young woman named Vivian sat on a wooden chair by the window. She wore a plain grey dress and a shawl the color of oatmeal. Her hair was pinned back in a way that had come loose in places, but she did not fix it. She was listening. 2 small beds stood along the far wall. In each bed slept a child. The older was a boy of about 6 years, and the younger was a girl who could not have been more than 4. They were curled tight under thin blankets, their small hands tucked beneath their chins. The boy had a scratch on his cheek that had scabbed over. The girl had lost one shoe somewhere along the road, and her bare foot poked out from the covers. Vivienne had tried 3 times to tuck it back, and each time the little foot had worked itself free again. She had found them at the gate. That was the plain truth of it, though she still could not quite believe it. She had been walking back to the servants' entrance after taking a jug of milk to old Mrs. Perrin at the gatehouse, and she had heard something in the hedge. A small sound. Not a cat, not a fox. Something too soft and too tired to be either. She had stopped. She had crouched down. And there, curled together in the wet grass beneath a hawthorn bush, were the 2 of them. The boy had his arms around the girl. Both of them had been shaking so hard their teeth clicked together. Their clothes were soaked through. The boy had looked up at her with eyes that had already given up hope, and he had said only one word. Please. Vivian had not asked any questions. She had picked up the little girl, who weighed almost nothing at all, and she had told the boy to take her hand. She had brought them straight to her own small room above the servants' hall, because she did not know where else to bring them. She had stripped their wet clothes and rubbed them dry with an old towel. She had wrapped them in her own blankets. She had heated a pan of milk over the small grate and made them drink it slowly, sip by sip, while their teeth stopped chattering. And then, because she did not know what else to do, she had put them into the 2 little beds that had once belonged to the housekeeper's own children, long ago before the housekeeper had left the manor to be married. The beds were dusty, but dry. Vivienne had beaten the dust out of the coverlets with the flat of her hand, while the children watched her with wide, silent eyes. Now they were asleep, and she was watching them. She had not lit a candle. She did not want the light to wake them. The room was lit only by the last small glow from the grate, and by the pale sliver of moon that had finally pushed through the clouds outside the window. The moon made a long, thin stripe across the floor and touched the toes of the little girl's foot where it stuck out from the blanket. Vivienne pulled her shawl tighter. The room was cold. Her breath came out in small white clouds, and the stone floor bit through the soles of her thin house shoes. She could smell the wet wool of the children's clothes drying by the fire, and beneath that the sharp green smell of hawthorn that still clung to their hair. Somewhere far below in the great empty house, a clock struck 2. 2 in the morning. 4 hours, perhaps 5, until the house began to wake. She thought about that. She thought about it very carefully. The housekeeper of the manor was a woman named Mrs. Ledwick. Mrs. Ledwick was not a cruel woman, exactly, but she was a woman who believed in rules. She believed in a place for everything and everything in its place. 2 strange children in a bed that did not belong to them, brought in without permission by a girl who worked in the still room and had no authority to bring anyone anywhere, would not fit into Mrs. Ledwick's sense of order. Mrs. Ledwick would send the children away. Vivienne did not know where Mrs. Ledwick would send them. Perhaps to the parish workhouse in the next village, perhaps back to the road. It did not matter. Anywhere Mrs. Ledwick sent them would be a place where they would not be warm, and would not be fed, and would not have anyone sitting up beside them while they slept. So Vivienne had made a decision. She would sit here through the night. She would guard them. When the house began to stir, she would think of what to do next. But until then, no one would take them from this room. No one would even know they were here. She would keep them safe until the sky turned pale, and then she would find some way to keep them safe after that too. She adjusted her shawl and settled back against the hard wood of the chair. Her back already ached. She did not mind. She had spent longer nights on harder chairs, and for less good a reason. The children slept. Vivienne was 19 years old. She had come to the manor 2 years before, when her mother had died and her father had proved unable to keep the small house they had lived in. She had been given the position of still-room maid because the old lady of the house, the Dowager Duchess, had known Vivienne's grandmother a long time ago and had felt some faint obligation. It was not a bad position. She made preserves and herbal waters and small pots of ointment. She worked mostly alone. She was overlooked, most of the time, which suited her. She was not, she had been told many times, a beautiful girl. She had brown hair that would not curl, and a plain face and hands that were always slightly stained from the herbs she pressed. She was quiet. She did not laugh loudly or sing in the corridors. Most of the servants at the manor did not remember her name. 2 of them called her Vera, and 1 called her Verity. And she had long since stopped correcting them. But she had a good ear. She could tell when a child was too tired to speak. She could tell when a small hand was trembling not from cold, but from fear. The little girl in the far bed made a small sound in her sleep, and Vivienne stood up at once and crossed to her. She put her hand very gently on the child's forehead. The forehead was warm, but not too warm, not fever-warm, just the good warm of a small body that was finally not freezing. Vivienne let out a breath she had not known she was holding. She sat down on the edge of the little bed. Very carefully, she reached under the blanket and found the bare foot. She tucked it back under the covers. She kept her hand there, cupped around the small heel, until she was sure the child would not kick free again. The child had a face like a small pale flower. Her eyelashes were very long and dark against her cheeks. There was a smudge of dirt still on her chin that Vivienne had missed when she had washed her. "You are safe," Vivienne said, very quietly. She did not say it to wake the child. She said it because she needed to say it out loud, into the room, so that the room would hold it. The boy stirred in the other bed. Vivienne turned. He had not woken, but he had rolled over, and now his small hand was thrown out across the pillow, palm up, fingers slightly curled. It was the hand of a boy who had held his sister for a long time and had only just let go. Vivienne looked at that hand for a long moment. She was not a woman who cried. She had not cried when her mother had died. She had not cried when her father had told her he could not keep her. She had not cried on the long walk to the manor in shoes that had already worn through at the heel. But something about the small open palm of the sleeping boy pressed against her chest in a way that felt very close to crying. She swallowed. She stood up. She went back to her chair by the window. The wind pushed at the glass. Somewhere out in the park, an owl called once, low and long. Vivienne listened. She listened for footsteps in the corridor. She listened for the creak of a floorboard. She listened for the sound of anyone in the great house waking up and moving toward this small room where 2 children slept who did not belong here. She heard nothing. She began, without meaning to count. Not sheep. She had never been the sort of girl to count sheep. She counted the panes of glass in the tall window. 12 panes, 4 across and 3 down. She counted them again. 12, she counted the beams in the low ceiling. 6, she counted the small dark knots in the wooden floorboards. She lost count at 40 and started again. This was her old habit. When she was afraid, or when she was very tired, or when she did not know what would happen next, she counted things. Small things, countable things. It was a way of keeping her mind from wandering into the places that would hurt her. Her mother had done the same thing, near the end. Vivienne had learned it from watching her. 12 panes, 6 beams, 40-something knots. The night went on. At some point, perhaps 3, perhaps a little after, Vivienne must have dozed. She did not mean to. But when she opened her eyes again, the sky outside the window had changed. It was not light yet, but the sharp black of deepest night had softened. There was a grey edge to the world now, low along the horizon, where the park sloped down toward the river. Dawn was coming. Her heart, which had been quiet all night, gave a small, hard thump against her ribs. She stood up. Her legs ached. She had been sitting too still for too long. She crossed to the little beds. The children still slept. The boy's hand had curled again. The girl's foot was still tucked under. Vivian pressed her palms together and thought she would need to move them before the housemaids began their morning rounds. That meant before 6. She had perhaps 2 hours. She would move them to the old still room where she worked. No one else went there. She could hide them in the low cupboard behind the drying rack until she could think of a better plan. She could bring them bread and milk from the kitchen. She could find better clothes for them in the rag bag that Mrs. Ledwick kept for cleaning cloths. There was a length of pale blue wool in there that might make a shawl for the little girl. She was making a list in her head, quiet and practical, when she heard the sound. Not footsteps. Not exactly. A door had opened somewhere below. Vivienne went very still. Servants did not open doors at this hour. Not the heavy front doors. The kitchen door, perhaps, if the scullery girl was up early to lay the fires. But the sound she had heard was not the small, light click of the kitchen latch. It was a deeper sound. A larger door. Below, and to the west, where the front hall lay. She held her breath. She listened. Footsteps, slow, even footsteps, on the stone floor of the great hall. A man's footsteps. Boots, heavy but not hurried. The kind of footsteps that belonged to a man who was not trying to be quiet because he did not think there was anyone to hear him. Vivienne pressed her hand against the wall. The Duke. She had never met him. He had been away from the manor for the whole of her 2 years there. He was, she had been told, a young man who had inherited very young and who spent most of his time in London, or on the continent, or at his other estate in the north. He was said to be a serious man, quiet, not fond of company. The old Dowager Duchess spoke of him fondly, in the way one speaks of a beloved child who has grown into a stranger. He was not expected. She was quite certain of that. Mrs. Ledwick would have had the whole house in an uproar for a week beforehand if the Duke had been expected. There would have been fresh linens on every bed and beeswax on every panel. There had been none of that. He had come without warning. Vivienne looked at the children. She looked at the door. She could hear the footsteps on the stairs now. The great staircase in the front hall. He was coming up. He was coming up alone. No valet. No footman. Just the one pair of boots on the stone. Steady. Unhurried. She thought very quickly. If she stayed in this room, and he came through this wing on his way to his own chambers, and he heard a sound, and he opened the door, he would find her. And the children. And she would have to explain, in the dark, with no time to prepare, why 2 strange children were sleeping in beds that did not belong to them, in a house that did not belong to them. He would send them away. She was almost sure of that. He was a duke. Dukes did not take in stray children found in hedges. Dukes had estates to manage and reputations to keep. He would send them away, and he would probably send her away too, and by breakfast the children would be gone and she would have nothing at all to show for the night except a stiff back and a broken heart. She thought this quite clearly, without drama. Then she thought something else. She thought, he will not send them away if he does not know they are here. She crossed the room, very quietly, on the balls of her feet. She reached the door. She turned the key in the lock. The key made a small dry click that sounded to her, as loud as a pistol shot. She winced. She waited. The footsteps on the stairs did not change. He had not heard. She let out her breath. She turned. She went back to her chair by the window. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She listened. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. They paused. For one long moment, Vivienne could hear nothing at all. Then the footsteps began again, and they turned, and they came along the corridor toward the east wing. Toward her. She closed her eyes. The footsteps came closer. Closer. She could hear the small creak of the boards under his weight. She could hear the faint brush of his coat against the wall as he passed a narrow place. And then the footsteps passed her door. They did not slow. They did not stop. They went on down the corridor, toward the chambers at the far end where the master's rooms lay. They grew fainter. A door opened. A door closed. The house was quiet again. Vivienne opened her eyes. She realized her hands were shaking. She pressed them together very tightly, and after a moment they stopped. She looked at the children. They had not stirred. They slept on, the boy with his hand thrown out, the girl with her foot fighting free of the blanket. They did not know that a duke had just walked past their door in the dark. They did not know how close they had come, and they did not know how close they might still come. Vivienne stood up. She went to the little girl's bed and tucked the foot back under the blanket. This time she stayed there, with her hand cupped around the small heel, for a longer moment. "You are still safe," she said, very quietly. She thought about the man who had walked past the door. She thought about him with a strange feeling that was not quite fear. He had walked as though he did not want to be greeted. He had come in the dark. He had brought no one with him. He had come to his own great empty house at 3 in the morning, and he had climbed his own great staircase alone, and he had gone to his own rooms without waking anyone. That was not, Vivienne thought, the behavior of a man who wanted to be at home. She did not know why she thought that. But she thought it, and once she had thought it, she could not quite unthink it. She went back to her chair. She sat down. Outside the window, the grey at the horizon had deepened to a paler grey, and then to something that was almost, but not quite, the colour of pearl. She counted the panes of glass. 12. She counted the beams. 6. She counted the knots on the floor and lost count at 50. The children slept. The dawn came very slowly. It was not a bright dawn. The rain had passed, but the clouds were still low, and the light that pushed its way into the room was the soft, kind, grey light of an English morning after a hard night. It touched the boy's cheek first. It moved across the pillow and touched the girl's forehead. It lit the strand of the girl's fair hair that had fallen across her mouth. Vivienne watched the light move. At some point, she must have leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, because when the small sound came at the door, she jerked upright and did not know for a moment where she was. The sound came again. Not a knock, not exactly. A small, careful sound. Someone testing the latch. Vivienne's heart went very still. She stood up. She moved between the children and the door. She was not a large woman. She was not a strong woman. But she stood between them, and she set her feet apart, and she waited. The latch moved. It rattled against the lock. It stopped. There was a small pause. Then, very quietly, a voice. "Is someone in there?" It was a man's voice. Low, not angry, not loud, only careful, in the way a man is careful when he is not sure what he will find on the other side of a door. Vivienne did not answer. The voice came again. "I will not do any harm, but the door is locked from the inside. Someone is in there." Vivienne pressed her hand to her mouth. She looked at the children. The little girl had opened her eyes. She was looking at Vivienne with the wide, dark eyes of a child who has been quiet for so long that she has forgotten she is allowed to make sound. The boy was still asleep, but his hand had closed into a small fist on the pillow. The voice on the other side of the door was very patient. "I am the master of this house," the voice said. "I would like to know who is in this room." Vivienne closed her eyes. She counted, very quickly in her head, to 5. She opened her eyes. She crossed to the door. She put her hand on the key. She turned it. The lock gave a small, dry click. She opened the door. The Duke stood in the corridor. He was not what she had expected. She had expected, somehow, a grand and terrible figure. She had expected a man who filled the doorway like a portrait. He did not fill the doorway. He was tall, but not enormously tall. He was dressed in a plain dark coat that had a little dust of travel still clinging to the shoulder. His hair was dark and slightly damp at the ends, as though he had washed his face but not fully dried it. There were shadows under his eyes. He was not classically handsome. His nose had been broken at some point in his life and had not been set quite straight. His mouth was serious. But he had a way of standing that made the corridor seem to arrange itself around him. His gaze, when it settled on her, was heavy, not unkind, only very, very steady. He looked at her for a long moment. He did not speak at once. He smelled, faintly, of rain and wood smoke, and something underneath that she could not name. Then his eyes moved past her. He saw the 2 little beds, He saw the two small sleeping shapes. He saw the boy's fist on the pillow, and the girl's dark eyes looking up at him from the far bed. He was quiet for a long time. Vivienne could hear her own heart in her ears. She could hear the small wet drip of water from a gutter somewhere outside. She could hear the faint crackle of the last coals in the grate. The Duke stepped back a small step. He did not come into the room. "You are not a nurse," he said. "It was not a question." "No, sir. You are not a governess." "No, sir. You work in this house." "Yes, sir, in the still room, sir." He nodded slowly, as though this was information he was filing away with care. His eyes went back to the children. The little girl had not moved. She was still watching him. "Whose children are these?" he said. Vivienne swallowed. "I do not know, sir." His eyes came back to her. He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, tired. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him about the hawthorn hedge, and the word please, and the wet clothes, and the milk on the grate. She told him about the two little beds that had once belonged to the housekeeper's children. She told him about the key in the lock and the counting of the ceiling beams. She did not tell him she had heard him pass in the night. She could not tell him that. She did not know why. She told it all in short, simple sentences, standing very straight, her hands folded in front of her. She did not cry. She did not beg. She only told him what had happened. When she was done, he did not speak at once. He looked past her again, at the children. The little girl who had been watching him with her wide dark eyes had grown tired. Her eyelids were sagging. As Vivienne watched, they closed. The child was asleep again. The Duke let out a long breath. "You sat with them all night," he said. "Yes, sir, without a candle. I did not wish to wake them, sir. You locked the door." Vivienne felt her face grow warm. "Yes, sir. Against whom?" She did not answer. He looked at her, and then, to her great surprise, something very small moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was the ghost of what might one day become a smile, if it were fed and cared for. It vanished at once. "Against me," he said quietly. "I did not know it was you, sir. You knew it was someone." "Yes, sir." He nodded again. He looked down at his own boots for a moment. Then he looked up. "What is your name?" "Vivienne, sir." "Vivienne what?" "Vivienne Brooke, sir." He said the name once, quietly, as though testing the shape of it. Then he stepped back another step, into the corridor. "Miss Brooke," he said, "stay with them. Do not let anyone else into this room. I will send for you shortly." "Yes, sir," he turned. He walked away down the corridor. His step was steady, unhurried, exactly as it had been in the night. He did not look back. Vivienne closed the door. She did not lock it this time. She leaned her forehead against the wood and stayed there for a long moment, until her breath came back to her. The little girl slept. The boy slept. Vivienne turned. She crossed to her chair. She sat down. She had thought when she opened the door that everything was lost, that the children would be sent away within the hour, that she would be dismissed by noon, that she had failed them. She was not so sure now. She did not know what the Duke would do. He had asked her name. He had told her to stay. He had not shouted. He had not been cruel. He had looked at the children with something in his face that she could not quite read. She counted the panes of glass. 12, she counted the beams. 6. Her hands, when she pressed them against her lap, were steady now. She waited. The Duke did not send for her at once. An hour passed. She heard the house begin to wake below. She heard the far-distant clatter of the scullery, the light, quick step of a housemaid crossing the front hall. She heard, once, the sharp voice of Mrs. Ledwick giving an order about the fires. Nobody came near the east wing. The children woke. They woke together, as though they had agreed on it in their sleep. The boy sat up first, blinking, his hand going at once to the bed where his sister lay. When he saw her still there, he let out a small breath. He looked around the room. He saw Vivienne. He remembered. "You," he said. "Me," Vivienne said. She stood up and came over to the bed. "Are you warm?" He nodded. "Are you hungry?" He nodded again. The little girl was sitting up now too, her hair a soft tangle around her face. She looked at Vivienne. She did not speak. She had not spoken once, Vivienne realized, since they had come to the manor. Not one word. Only the boy had spoken, and only that one word, please. Vivian knelt down between the two beds. She did not touch them yet. She waited. "I am going to try to find you something to eat," she said. "You must stay in this room. You must be very quiet." "Can you do that?" The boy nodded. The little girl looked at her brother, and then at Vivienne, and after a moment she also nodded. Just a small nod. But she had made a choice, and she had told Vivienne what her choice was, and that was almost as good as speaking. Vivienne felt something ease in her chest. She was just standing up when there was a knock at the door. It was not the Duke's knock. This knock was brisk. 2 hard taps. Vivienne knew that knock. It was Mrs. Ledwick. She had come. Vivienne straightened. She smoothed her apron. She crossed to the door. She opened it just enough to see the housekeeper's face. Mrs. Ledwick was a tall, thin woman of about 50, with iron-grey hair pulled into a tight knot and a mouth that had, over the years, forgotten how to soften. She was holding a tray. On the tray was a small china pot of tea, a jug of milk, 2 plates, and a stack of buttered bread cut into small triangles. There was also a bowl of stewed apples. Mrs. Ledwick's face was tight. "His Grace instructs me to bring this," she said. She said it as though each word cost her something. "He instructs me to say that the children are to remain in this room until he sends for them. He instructs me to say that no one, apart from myself and yourself, is to enter this wing. He instructs me to say that if any word of the children reaches the servants' hall, he will know from whom it came, and he will act accordingly." She held out the tray. Vivienne took it. It was heavier than she had expected. Mrs. Ledwick did not release the tray at once. She held it, and Vivienne held it, and for one long moment the 2 women looked at each other across the small china pot. "I do not know what game you are playing, Mrs. Ledwick said, very low. "But a girl of your station does not bring strays into a duke's house. You will regret this before the week is out." She let go of the tray. She turned. She walked away. Vivienne stood in the doorway for a moment with the tray in her hands. The children were watching her from their beds. The little girl's dark eyes were very wide. Vivienne closed the door with her foot. She came back into the room. She set the tray on the small table by the window. She poured milk into 2 cups. She cut the small triangles of bread into even smaller pieces. She spooned stewed apples onto both plates. She brought the plates to the children. They ate. They ate slowly at first, in small, careful bites, as though they were not quite sure the food was for them. Then they ate faster. The boy finished his bread and started on the apples. The little girl, who had not spoken, took her cup of milk in both hands and drank it all the way down, and when she set the cup back on the plate, she gave Vivienne a look that was not quite a smile but was very close to one. Vivienne sat on the edge of the boy's bed and watched them eat. She did not eat any of it herself. She had not thought to bring an extra cup for herself, and she did not want to take from theirs. When they were done, she took the plates away. She set them back on the tray. She poured the last of the milk into one of the cups and offered it to the little girl, who drank it, more slowly this time, and then reached out one small hand and touched the back of Vivienne's wrist. Vivienne looked down at the small hand. She did not move for a long moment. She was afraid that if she moved, the little hand would go away. The little girl left her hand there. Her fingers were warm now. They were not shaking. The boy had lain back down. He was watching the ceiling. His face was thoughtful in the way of a very small boy who has been carrying something too heavy for his shoulders and does not yet know he is allowed to set it down. "What is your name?" Vivienne asked him gently. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tobias." "Tobias what?" "I do not remember," he said. He said it plainly, without shame. He was not lying. He simply did not remember. Vivienne did not press. "And your sister?" He looked over at the little girl. "Sella," he said. "Her name is Sella." Sella. It was a small, soft name that suited the child. "Where did you come from, Tobias?" He shook his head. He did not know that either, or he did not want to say. Vivienne could not tell which. She did not press him. She sat with them. The morning wore on. The grey light from the window brightened by very small degrees. Vivienne told the children a story about a cat who lived in a boot. She had made the story up on the spot, and it was not a very good story, But Sela watched her mouth as she told it with an intensity that felt like being drunk to the last drop by someone very thirsty. Tobias listened too, though he pretended not to. When the story was over, they slept again. Sela curled her small body against her brother's, in the same bed this time, and the two of them fell asleep with their foreheads almost touching. Vivienne pulled the blanket up over them. She turned. She sat back down in her chair by the window. Someone knocked at the door. This time the knock was different. Not brisk, not sharp. A slow, single knock, low on the wood. She knew before she opened it who was on the other side. She opened the door. The Duke stood in the corridor. He had changed his coat. He had washed. His hair was combed back from his forehead in a way that made the shadows under his eyes even more visible. He was carrying a small folded piece of paper. He did not come in. He glanced past her, at the children, and when he saw them curled together in the one bed, his mouth moved again in that small, almost smile that never quite finished. "Miss Brooke," he said. "Walk with me." She hesitated. "The children, sir. They will sleep another hour. I have set a footman at the far end of the corridor. He will not enter the room. He will only see that no one else does." She nodded. She stepped out of the room. She closed the door quietly behind her. They walked together down the long corridor. He did not offer her his arm. She had not expected him to. She was a servant of his house, and he was a duke, and there were rules to these things even in an empty house at an unusual hour. But he slowed his step so that she could keep pace with him easily. And he did not walk in front of her. He walked beside her. At the top of the great staircase, he stopped. "Tell me again," he said, "how you found them." She told him again. She told him more this time, the exact place in the hedge, the exact sound she had heard, the way Tobias's arms had been wrapped around Sela. The word "please." She told him the small details she had not thought to mention before. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sit," he said, and he gestured to the top step of the stair. She was startled. One did not sit on the great staircase of a duke's house. But he had said to sit, and so she sat, and after a moment he sat as well, one step below her, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loose between them. He did not look at her when he spoke. "My brother," he said, "had 2 children, a boy and a girl. His wife died in childbirth with the girl. He never recovered from it. He drank. He wandered. He would go for months and I would not know where he was. 6 weeks ago, I had word that he had died in a village near the coast. I was told the children had been taken in by his wife's family. I made arrangements to have them fetched to me here." He paused. He turned the folded paper in his hands. "The messenger I sent," he said, "returned yesterday. The wife's family had not taken the children. They had passed them along to a distant cousin. The distant cousin had passed them along to a woman who kept a boarding house. The woman who kept the boarding house had put them on a coach with a shilling and a note pinned to the boy's coat that said he was to be delivered here. The coach had left them at the crossroads, 2 miles from this gate, at dusk the night before last." Vivienne could not speak. Her hands were pressed together very hard in her lap. "The messenger," the Duke said, "did not know they had been left at the crossroads. He learned only that they had been sent. He came ahead to tell me they were coming. I rode through the night to be here when they arrived. I had planned to meet them at the gate this morning." He turned the paper again. His fingers were long and steady. "They arrived," he said, 12 hours before I did. In the rain. In a hedge. With one shoe between them." His voice did not change. It stayed low and steady. But Vivienne could hear something in it now that she had not heard before. It was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the sound of a man who has just learned that he was too late for something that mattered, and who is now trying to understand what it means that he was too late. "They would have died," he said, "if you had not been walking back from the gatehouse." "I do not know that, sir. I do." He turned his head then, and he looked at her. His eyes were very direct. She had not been looked at that way in a long time. Perhaps ever. She wanted to look down, and she made herself not look down. "You sat with them through the night," he said. "You gave them your own blankets. You warmed milk on your own grate. You locked the door against me because you thought I would send them away. "Yes, sir, you did all of this," he said, without knowing whose children they were. "Yes, sir." He was quiet again. He looked away, down the length of the staircase, at the pale grey light coming through the tall window on the landing. "They are my brother's children," he said quietly. "They are the last of my blood, and you guarded them through the night. Unaware," he said the word slowly. "Unaware. It sat in the air between them. I found them at dawn," he said, "in beds you had made for them, in a room you had locked, guarded by a girl who does not know how much I owe her." Vivienne could not speak. She looked at her hands. He did not press her to speak. He gave her the moment. He sat one step below her on the great staircase of his own house, and he waited, and she was grateful for it in a way she did not know how to name. At last she said, "They are good children, sir. Yes, the little girl has not spoken. Not yet. But she will. Yes. The boy is called Tobias. The girl is Sella." He nodded. It seemed that he already knew this. Perhaps he had known this all along. Perhaps this was the paper he had been turning in his hands. "They will need a nurse," he said, "and a governess in time, and clothes, and a doctor to look at that scratch on the boy's cheek. Yes, sir, they will need," he said, "someone who does not care whether they are the children of a duke's brother or the children of no one at all. Someone who has already sat with them through a night." He did not turn his head, but she felt his attention. It rested on her without weight. "Miss Brooke," he said, "would you be willing to remain with them?" She was quiet. She had thought he might say something like this. She had not let herself hope for it. Hope was a costly thing. She had learned that early. "I have no training as a nurse, sir. You have more than training. You have already done the work. I am a still-room maid, sir. It is not proper." "I do not care what is proper," he said. Then, more quietly, "I care what is right." She looked up at him then. He was looking at her. The shadows under his eyes were still there, but there was something in his face that had not been there in the corridor an hour before. It was something like the very first easing of a long-held weight. "Yes, sir," she said. "I will stay with them." He nodded once. He stood up. He held out his hand. She looked at the hand. Then she put her own hand into it, and she let him help her to her feet. His hand was warm and dry. He released her at once. "Thank you," he said. He said it plainly, not as a great man to a small one, as one person to another. Then he turned. He walked away down the corridor toward his own rooms. She stood at the top of the staircase and watched him go, and when he was out of sight she pressed her hand against the wall, exactly the way she had pressed it against the wall on the night she had left another house long ago, and she breathed. She went back to the children. They were still asleep. She sat down in her chair by the window. She counted the panes of glass. 12, she counted the beams. 6. She lost count of the knots on the floor. She did not care. The days that followed were not simple, but they were good. The children were given the 2 little rooms next to Vivienne's own, which was moved from the servants' quarters up to a small proper chamber near theirs. Clothes were sent for. A doctor came from the town and looked at Tobias's cheek and said it would heal without a scar. He looked at Sella and said she was in good health and would speak when she was ready, and not before, and that no one should press her. Mrs. Ledwick, to her great credit, adjusted. She did not soften exactly, but she adjusted. She saw that the Duke had made his decision, and she saw that Vivienne was not, in fact, playing a game. She began to bring the trays herself in the mornings, and to leave without speaking, and after a week she began to ask, in the shortest sentences she could manage, whether the children were sleeping well. The Duke stayed at the manor. He did not go back to London. He did not go north. He rode out early each morning on estate business, and he came back before the children's supper, and he ate with them in the small nursery, sitting on a chair that was slightly too small for him, cutting the boy's meat with a serious face, while Sella watched him from behind a spoon. He did not press Sella to speak. He did not in fact press her to do anything at all. He simply sat with her. He learned that she liked the color pale blue. He learned that she was afraid of the tall clock in the front hall because of the way it struck the hour. He had the clock moved to a further room. He did not mention it. Vivienne learned of it from a footman, who mentioned it only in passing, as though it were nothing. That was the moment, though Vivienne did not know it then, that she understood what kind of man the Duke was. He had moved the clock. He had told no one why. He had not spoken of it to the child. He had simply removed the thing that frightened her, quietly, when no one was watching. There were harder moments too. A cousin of the Duke's, a woman named Lady Marchant, arrived unannounced one afternoon. She was a tall, thin woman with a face like polished bone, and she had heard, somehow, that 2 strange children had been installed in her cousin's manor. She had come to see for herself. She was received in the drawing room. Vivienne, who had brought the children down at the Duke's request, stood beside them near the door. Sella held on to a fold of Vivienne's skirt with one small fist. Tobias stood as straight as a small soldier. Lady Marchant looked at them for a long moment. "They have the family nose," she said at last. "One can see it. What a pity about the mother's blood." She said it as though she were remarking on the weather. The Duke did not answer at once. He had been standing by the fire. He did not move. His face did not change. But Vivienne, who had by now learned to read the very small things about him, saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. "You will not speak of the children's mother in that manner in this house," he said very quietly. "Not again. Not ever." Lady Marchant opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at him, and she saw what was in his face, and after a moment she rose from her chair. "Well," she said, "I see how it is. I hope you do." She left before dinner. She did not return. The Duke did not speak of the scene afterward. But that evening, in the nursery, he sat down beside Sella on the small rug where she was playing with a wooden horse, and he said, quite simply, "You look like your mother." She was a very kind woman. "You have her hands." Sella looked at her hands. She turned them over slowly. She did not speak, but she put one of her small hands, very gently, on the Duke's knee, and she left it there. He did not move. He stayed exactly as he was on the small rug until she took her hand away of her own accord. That night, walking Vivienne to the door of the nursery, he stopped in the corridor. "Miss Brooke," he said. "Yes, sir, I have not thanked you properly." "You have thanked me, sir," on the staircase. That was thanks for one night. She did not know what to say. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When you found them in the hedge, and you decided to bring them to your room and to guard them through the night, did you know that the door would open? Did you know that the person on the other side would not send them away?" "No, sir. You did it anyway." "Yes, sir," he looked at her. The corridor was lit by a single candle on a small table between them. The light was warm on the side of his face. The other side was in shadow. "Why?" he said. She thought about it. She could have given him 100 pretty answers. She gave him the true one. "Because they were cold, sir, and because no one else was going to." He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Brooke," he said, "I do not know what I have done to deserve that you should have been the person walking past that hedge. I do not know why you and not another. But I am grateful. I will be grateful for the rest of my life." She could not speak. She looked at the floor. He did not press her. He bowed, very slightly. He turned. He walked away down the corridor. She stood there for a long time. Then she went into the nursery. She sat between the 2 little beds. She looked at Tobias, sleeping with his hand thrown out across the pillow. She looked at Sella, whose foot was, as always, fighting free of the blanket. She tucked the small foot back under. "You are safe," she said, quietly, this time. When she said it, she believed it in a way she had not believed it before. A full year passed. Sella began to speak. Not all at once. First a word, then 2, then a slow, soft sentence one morning at breakfast that made Tobias drop his spoon in surprise. She spoke most easily to Vivienne. She spoke almost as easily to the Duke. She would speak to Mrs. Ledwick when she had to. She never quite spoke to strangers, and no one pressed her. Tobias grew. He learned to ride a small pony. He learned to read. He argued cheerfully with his uncle about the correct way to hold a fishing rod, and lost every argument, and did not seem to mind losing. The manner changed. It was not a sudden change. It was a slow, quiet, steady change. The fires were laid a little differently. The windows in the east wing were opened. A room that had been closed for years was reopened, and turned into a small schoolroom with a low table and 2 small chairs and a good bright window that faced the garden. Vivienne was no longer, exactly, a servant. She was not, exactly, a governess. She was called Miss Brooke by the household, and she took her meals with the children, and sometimes with the Duke in the small parlour when he asked. She had a proper wage now, and proper clothes, and hands that were no longer stained from herbs. She still counted things, sometimes. Ceiling beams, panes of glass, small knots in wooden floors. She still could not quite believe, on some mornings, that any of it was real. On an evening in the following spring, exactly 1 year after the night in the hedge, the Duke walked with her in the garden. The children had gone to bed. The sky was pale and pink at the edges. The smell of new grass was strong. Somewhere in the trees a small bird was saying good-night to itself in short, soft notes. They walked in silence for a time. It was a comfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who no longer felt they had to fill the quiet with sound. At the top of the low rise, near the hawthorn hedge, he stopped. "Miss Brooke," he said. "Yes, sir, Vivian." He had never used her first name before. It sat between them like a small, careful thing. "Yes," she said. He did not turn to face her. He looked out over the park. The last light of the day was on his face. "I am not," he said, "a man who is very good with words. I have not asked for very many things in my life. I have not wanted very many things." She was quiet. "But I would like to ask you," he said, "if you would consider staying at this manor not as their governess, but as my wife." She looked at him. He turned his head then. He looked at her. "I do not ask this because of what you did for them," he said. "That is a debt I could never repay in a lifetime, and I will not try to repay it this way. I ask it because in the last year I have discovered that I do not know how to be in this house without you in it. I ask because when I ride back in the evening from the far fields, I look for the light in the nursery window before I look for anything else. I ask because you are the person I want to sit beside on the stair." She could not speak. "You need not answer now," he said. "You need not answer at all if the answer is no. Nothing will change for you or for the children. You will remain here, and be honored here, and be safe here, for the rest of your life. I give you my word on that separately. I want you to know that first." She thought about all the answers she could give. She gave him the true one. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. The small, almost smile came again to the corner of his mouth. This time it finished. He held out his hand. She put her hand in his. They stood there, on the low rise near the hawthorn hedge, in the pale spring evening. And neither of them said anything for a long moment. Above them, the first star of the night came out, small and steady. Somewhere below, in the great house, a light burned in the nursery window, where two small children slept, who were, for the first time in their small lives, entirely and unshakably safe. She had guarded them through the night, unaware, and the Duke had found them at dawn. And out of that one long dark and that one grey morning, 3 lost people had, without meaning to, found their way home.